Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. We thought it was a superior idea overall. Yeah. You would therefore cave to one another. Yeah. The image of Paul McCartney that most people imagine, they perceive the innocent Beatle with the melodious bass lines and a mischievous glint in his eye, a worldwide icon who helped reimagine pop music, the mastermind behind Yesterday. However, beneath the charisma, stadium songs, and that irresistible smile, there is a man with keen instincts and even more incisive ideas. Paul McCartney has painted a diplomatic picture for the public, but his close associates know the truth. Paul doesn't hold back when it comes to his songs. He has no qualms about expressing his dislikes and is forthright about his preferences. He has had discreet disagreements with several famous musicians over the years. Not only that, but his complaints extended beyond simple differences in character. They mirrored substantial artistic disagreements over the values that music should embody. Now we're going to discover why not even legends were able to escape the charming, or not so cute, criticisms of the Beatles, and we're going to count down the 6 bands that Paul McCartney couldn't stand. The animosity that shaped a time is where it all begins. The Stones, the Rolling. True competitors or blues imitators. The Rolling Stones. I am now your host for the evening. For decades, admirers hailed it as the pinnacle of musical rivalry, a clash between the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. In a so-called friendly rivalry, 2 iconic bands are pushing each other to greatness. However, Paul McCartney's demeanor wasn't always cordial behind the scenes. It is said that McCartney revealed his innermost sentiments during a private 1968 Abbey Road session. He compared the Rolling Stones to a lucky blues cover band. That hurtful comment didn't garner much attention when it happened, but it laid the groundwork for a tension that would simmer for decades. After all this time, Paul was still doing little swings in 2021. The Stones are a blues cover band, he stated in an interview with The New Yorker. We cast a slightly wider net. Mick Jagger made sure that wasn't left hanging. In response, he clapped along, making a joke about the Beatles' long-running Ringo controversy and how they were really only a 4-piece band with 1 drummer. Those in the know claim that Paul believed the Stones were constantly playing catch-up with the Beatles, releasing albums that replicated ideas the Fab Four had previously explored months prior. When John Lennon proposed making a Stones album, in 1969, it was a really painful moment. Claiming to wonder why John would bother with a band that Paul thought was derivative, Paul was understandably enraged. In passing, McCartney has complimented a couple Stones songs here and there, but the tone has always been sharp. Something cool and unsolved still flits in his voice, even in public interviews. You won't believe what Paul had to say about the thugs who attempted to set it on fire if he could be so direct about his contemporaries from that time. Punk rock, personal insults, the Sex Pistols. The punk subculture was the one that really irritated Paul McCartney. Paul had spent decades perfecting everything else, but it was raw, careless, and purposefully unpolished. And the Sex Pistols were right in the middle of that wild uprising. In 1976, the Anarctic foursome didn't merely emerge with a cynical disregard. For musical heritage, a statement it was. Something that stood in stark contrast to what McCartney and the Beatles had accomplished. Paul supposedly said that their music was an attack on the ears, since it felt like an open attack to him. It baffles me that some people find satisfaction in their incompetence as an instrumentalist. But the contempt wasn't limited to just one side. Johnny Rotten, who was never shy about saying what he thought, branded Paul as a relic of the antiquated establishment punk scene and swore to wipe him off the face of the earth. And what was the final straw that broke McCartney's resolve? The Sex Pistols reportedly used Beatles posters as target practice during rehearsals, according to Denny Sewell, the drummer of the Wings. Even though Paul attempted to shrug it off, his loved ones acknowledged it hurt more than he was letting on. The 2 groups were at London's AIR studios in the beginning of 1977 recording. Sid Vicious muttered something about being a sellout to the establishment as Paul reached out a friendly hand to them in the hallway. It was that. Paul turned away silently and never looked back at them. Years down the road, McCartney would reluctantly acknowledge that punk had contributed to a more peaceful music industry. His abrupt response, "Not my cup of tea," accompanied by a clenched jaw and cold look, revealed more than words could convey when I asked him about the Sex Pistols in particular. The subsequent quarrel, however, did not originate from acts of rejection or resistance. Paul felt it had crossed the line into something far more annoying, originating from a place of admiration. Oasis, mimicry, or verbal abuse. That person doesn't have my trust. Oasis were the most audacious, flamboyant, and unabashedly obsessed act that Paul McCartney had ever seen. Liam and Noel Gallagher, brothers, took it upon themselves to seize the crown from the Beatles in the 1990s when British rock strutted its way back into the limelight. It wasn't merely that they sounded like the Beatles. They mimicked their every move, even to the way they posed. Their respect was well known. The Beatles were instrumental in making the Oasis what it is today. As No once said, it was seen as flattery by the people. Paul felt differently. Initially, McCartney made an effort to be cordial, praising Oasis as a talented and energetic band. However, when the lights were off, he was unimpressed. It seemed more like a marketing gimmick than a genuine appreciation. The fixation was superficial. It was the haughtiness that was the real problem, not the imitating. In a statement reminiscent of John Lennon's famous declaration from 1966, minus the subtlety, Noel Gallagher dared to assert that Oasis was more influential than the Beatles. That was hardly paying tribute to Paul. That was arrogance. Oasis, in his view, had not merited such comparisons. He said they sounded conceited and ostentatious, devoid of the heart and spirit that were hallmarks of genuine artistic expression. As he reportedly informed a buddy, "It's not enough to copy the chords. Get out there and enjoy life." The entitlement was his worst pet peeve. It wasn't simply the Beatles that Oasis admired. They behaved as if they were entitled to the inheritance. The idea irritated Paul. They weren't making anything tangible. He thought they were chasing after ghosts. But there was one subset whose mimicry was far more pervasive. Despite this, they conned their way into Beatles mythology in some mysterious way. For Paul's feelings about the Monkees went beyond simple copying. An odd sense of turmoil weighed on him. The Monkees made fun of things. Oral score. They had a meteoric rise to fame with songs that topped the charts. A television program. That was a smashing success and hordes of adoring followers. The Monkees, however, were little more than a joke for Paul McCartney. According to reports, he flat out rejected them, seeing only a plastic knockoff. The time one of the Beatles' songs played on the radio, Paul would switch the station, according to Alistair Taylor, who was a Beatles aide. Their voice wasn't the only thing that bothered him. Their whole being was involved. Compared to Paul, who had toiled away for years in seedy Hamburg clubs, sleeping in apartments rife with rats, and putting in relentless live sets, these four actors were given stardom for nothing. The moment the Monkees began imitating the psychedelic flair of the Beatles following the publication of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was the final straw for him. According to George Harrison, Paul had a fit and yelled out, "They're stealing our blueprint without doing any of the work." Even in face-to-face interactions, the animosity manifested. Legend has it that Paul abruptly left a 1968 Los Angeles party where he was having a talk with Mickey Dolenz, lead singer of the Monkees. "I don't think he ever recognized us as serious musicians," Dolenz said after the fact. As the Monkees struggled for autonomy and started penning their own songs, McCartney's stance remained unchanged. Paul made one of his signature backhanded compliments in an interview from 2011 when asked about them. Adorable songs, but definitely not the Beatles. His scorn, however it may have eased with time, remained constant. Plus, the following band wasn't trying to sound like the Beatles. They passed Paul and took over the charts, just as Paul's own momentum was fading. Acrimony at the Bee Gees' disco dominance. Oral score. Paul McCartney's reign over the charts started to wane in the late 1970s. As a result, disco became the dominant musical style in the rock industry. The Bee Gees, with their distinctive falsettos and Saturday Night Fever's unprecedented success, are at the forefront of this movement. A lot of people thought the Gibb brothers were geniuses in the pop music industry. They brought a fresh sound to the world, but Paul saw them as little more than a Beatles clone, just using dazzling voices and electronic drums to recycle old songs. Lawrence Juba, a guitarist for the Wings, claims that McCartney would hear their songs and say, "Same 3 chords as everyone else, just faster." As the Bee Gees started crushing records that the Beatles had held, his annoyance was growing behind the scenes. When the two musicians ended themselves sharing a Miami recording studio in 1979, tensions between them rose even higher. Reportedly, Paul deliberately avoided the BGS by scheduling his sessions around them so as to avoid any possibility of a run-in. It was brought to the attention of one studio engineer that the Bee Gees had recently surpassed yet another Beatles landmark. In response, Paul clenched his jaw, squinted his gaze, and remained silent. Despite attempts at showing grace, an air of coldness persisted. Unlike the emotional tributes he gave to other deceased greats, McCartney released a short, rather clinical, statement in response to Maurice Gibb's death in 2003. The statement consisted of only a few constrained phrases. People took note of it. According to those in the know, the animosity and competition never really subsided, even though he presented himself professionally in public. The band that challenged McCartney the most, however, was far worse than his. Problems with disco queens and punk rebels, an inspiration-born rivalry that ends in quiet and sadness. In the company of the Beach Boys, the sparks ignited a fiery rivalry. Oral score. Paul McCartney has frequently lauded God Only Knows Once, describing it as the ideal musical composition. But there's a complicated animosity that's been haunting him for decades, hidden underneath that beautiful praise. To Paul, Pet Sounds wasn't simply another album when it came out in 1966. This was a breakthrough. The emotional depth, arrangements, and harmonies of the music captivated him, and he listened to it over and over again. George Martin, a producer for the Beatles, claims that Paul's inspiration for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came from Pet Sounds. However, awe quickly transformed into rivalry. Paul McCartney listened intently as Brian Wilson started recording Smile, his ambitious follow-up album. Paul appeared to lose some of his empathy for Wilson after he left the project because of his mental health issues. At the time, he supposedly claimed that one shouldn't be in this line of work if they can't complete what they start. It makes no difference to us. We keep going. An argument escalated over a dinner gathering at Brian Wilson's house in 1967. Even if it was purposeful, Paul deemed some Beach Boys songs to be overly basic and repetitious. The comments apparently left Wilson so distraught that he remained silent for days. When questioned about the Beach Boys, McCartney continued to add qualifiers even in her latter years. In an interview, he mentioned that the band had beautiful harmonies. People tend to exaggerate the extent to which they can make a difference, in my opinion. By this point, we had made great progress. No matter how many times Paul brings up God Only Knows, he always manages to tack on some minor limits, such as, perfect yes, but only for American pop of that time. David Leaf, a music historian, put it succinctly. Paul does not want to concede that someone else had a hand in shaping the Beatles, so he will never confess how much Brian's work influenced him. Of all McCartney's feuds, that one may be the most incisive. He had trouble acknowledging who motivated him, in addition to those he couldn't stand. And with that, I leave you. 6 groups that Paul McCartney found intolerable, from the punk rockers, who made fun of his reputation, to the disco heavy hitters, who completely eclipsed his charts, to the musical geniuses, who inadvertently set him on fire. It turns out that McCartney's personal criticisms were so cutting that they reached even the most prominent musicians. Some feuds stemmed from genuine creative competition, while others were based on ego, imitation, or other superficial disagreements. One thing is evident, though. Paul McCartney has always been incredibly protective of the legacy he helped build, hidden behind that boyish smile and polished charm. After considering this, what is your opinion? Which rivalry took you by surprise? Were Paul's concerns well-founded, Or were they the product of a perfectionist who hated change? Please inform us by leaving a comment below. If you like learning about this obscure aspect of a music classic, please subscribe, like, and share this video for more hidden tales and epic battles from the history of music. Because there's usually some controversy surrounding iconic figures.